All right, today we're looking at the Revolutionary War and then society and how different peoples experienced the Revolutionary War. So the first thing that we're going to look at is actually the different phases of war and how they kind of played out in the process. So the first phase was not necessarily believed to be a phase by Britain, and that took place in New England and around 1776, and you could argue even the year before as well. Okay, so 1775, 1776. And so you have, this is the phase where you have the Boston agitators, as the British would have seen it. They definitely saw them as agitators. So this is the Sons of Liberty, looking at the various events like the Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party, those type of events. The British didn't see these as, and the boycotts. The British didn't see these as actual precursors to war. Definitely not. This was not. These were all agitations by agitators, especially these. That's who they blamed, the Sons of Liberty. Although and to be fair, it did start with the Sons of Liberty, but it grew obviously into a much larger phase than just the Sons of Liberty. But the British kind of honed in on the Sons of Liberty and saw them as the instigators or agitators of all of these events. But they did not see it as actually coming to war, more like little skirmishes and boycotts and protests that they might have to at some point squash, which is why they don't send, so we'll put, the British didn't take it seriously. And because they didn't take it seriously, they didn't send large forces of their military to quell this kind of uprising, if you will. It could have turned out very differently if they had seen this as more than, right, so it was seen as a small uprising. But if they'd seen it as more than a small uprising, you might not have the Revolutionary War at all, because that was definitely the period where the colonists were not fully engaged in the war. In fact, it really took the Intolerable Acts, Thomas Paine's Common Sense, to kind of push people into being prepared for the Declaration of Independence. And then obviously we'll see not everyone supported that anyways. The second phase was the mid-Atlantic phase, or region, but it's both the phase and region. And this was from 1776 to 1778. This is then where you have the Declaration of Independence. So, of course, the Declaration of Independence is going to be the more serious wake-up call for the British of, oh, this is not just agitators, this is not just a small uprising that we're going to have to put down. And so they do respond after the Declaration of Independence. Because remember, the Declaration of Independence would have been treason. That was why you had the saying as they signed this, well, we better all hang together or we will hang together. Because there was a recognition with the people signing it that they were signing potentially their death warrants. They were, by putting your name down, it gave the British someone specific to blame. If they won, those are the people who would have been charged with treason. There would have been others too, but those would have been the easy people to go after because their names were on the Declaration of Independence. And that was treason. So it took that kind of official act of treason to be let the British go, oh, well, this seems like it might be more than we thought. And then, of course, you also have had, but even with Lexington and Concord, those first little conflicts fighting between the British soldiers and the colonists, the Minutemen, that, wasn't, they still were in denial that this was anything other than a select group of people. After the Declaration of Independence, you have William Howe sent with 32,000 troops to take on the colonists, which, I don't know, may not seem like a lot when you look at numbers with the military today. But George Washington and the Continental Army, which was the official military of the colonists, and there are two types, and we'll talk about them in just a second. They had around, we'll say on average, 19,000. Okay, we have to say on average because it varied a lot more. It had a higher period for a time, and then it had a much lower number of people for a time. And that ultimately was because they weren't really getting paid. We'll talk about that. And if your wife wrote you and was like, "Hey, the farm is collapsing and we're not surviving," they were like, "Peace," and they took off. Others who just were like, "This sucks," and they also took off. and there wasn't you get more formal penalties for desertion in the Civil War. And there was some consequences some of the time, but the reality is that it was too fluid of a thing where people were like, I have a responsibility to make sure my wife and children don't starve back at home, so I'm gonna go. Or just, yeah, we're all starving here and I'm done. Then you had deaths that decreased the number as well, and there were a good number of deaths. So it varied. You can't give a concrete number other than in general the average seemed to hover around 19,000. So 32,000 troops with the British military, which was the best British, it was the best military, and they were seen as the best naval power in the world, and it certainly was seen as the most organized and disciplined military that they were going to go up against the Continental Army, which was not so well organized and or good. So that if you were betting, if you were like, oh crap, they just sent 32,000 British soldiers over, we're screwed, people would not have been betting on the colonist. It definitely was, there were many who believed that the British were going to win, and tactically, experience, organization wise, yeah, they looked like they kind of should have won that way. Okay, so that's the average. There's two types though of military that played a role in the Revolutionary War. The first was what we just mentioned, the Continental Army that was led by General George Washington. And then you had the State Militia. And they functioned very differently. So let's look at the Continental Army first. I'm just going to put a 1 the problem when I list stuff and then I'm like, but I still need to talk about it, but I wanted to mention both. So we'll rewrite the Continental Army so it's not confusing. I guess this makes it C. Okay, so with the Continental Army, they were the more, let's say, the more formal and traditional army. And that's in part because George Washington was leading them, but they practiced the more traditional warfare style of fighting. And that traditional style of fighting was to meet on open battlefield and kind of take turns shooting at each other. And the reason for this was, well, there was a couple of reasons. One was to keep civilians out of it. If you're having these clear-cut, we'll say, open field battles, and it was to keep civilians out. It also was seen as for tactics. This gets connected also to the type of weapon that they used, which was the muskets. You had, and this was a process, okay, so you had to put in the powder. They carried packets of powder, or they sometimes also had like tin cases that you put the powder in. And then you had to pour the powder in first. Then you put the musket ball in. And these ranged in size for caliber. And they were a ball. The early bullets were a ball. The style of bullet doesn't change until just before the Civil War, where you get the rifle bullet, which is more shaped like what we think of bullets today, and were far superior to the musket ball. And then you had to basically tamp it down, tap it down, pack it. There we go. That's the correct terminology. I was like, I knew it was in there somewhere. So then you had to pack it so that you would there was this long stick that went into the barrel of the gun, of the rifle, and you packed that down, and then you had to light it, light the fuse, and then we'll just say light it, and then of course pull the trigger. What is impressive is the fact that they could do this multiple times. Now, the fuse that you had with it was good for several shots. So you didn't have to light the fuse every single time, but those did require replacing, and then you had to relight them. So there was like a time limit to it. But you could get really qualified or good riflemen, if you will. They could easily get off 3 shots in a minute, which is super impressive considering the amount of things that you had to do. But this did create it kind of created the structure of how the battles were fought, because it was not super accurate. So you may aim at someone, but it doesn't mean that you actually hit that person unless you were close to them, because of ultimately the musket ball with how it came out of the barrel, right? There was no spinning, so it didn't keep in a straight line. It kind of just zigzagged around, and then it hit whatever it hit. Because of these things, right, this is where you had, if you had the open field, you had like 3 kind of lines, well, you had more lines than that, but 3 main lines that went at a time. So if we had the British on one side, we'll say that this is the British, and this was the colonist, right? And then you had the field here in the middle. Eventually, right, you are eventually moving towards each other. So, which is why you had the bayonet at the end of it, because it did often get up into close hand-to-hand combat. They also had swords. You didn't have the bayonet. They had attached something to it. The bayonet comes a little bit later. But you used a knife, and then they had stuff that had attachments to it. And then that officially became the bayonet later. And then they also had swords. And so that you would be fighting on the battlefield, first further away, and then in some cases up close. You also had, some soldiers had the smaller handgun, the revolver. I feel like that's not the right word for those early weapons, but they had a handgun, and those were one shots, and the same thing as with the rifles. And so if you got in closer, you could also use those, because obviously the longer weapon became hard to use in close quarters. And so you would eventually move forward, but what would happen is why it had this kind of feel of waiting around to be shot is that you would have the first line would go, and they would usually be laying down. And so they went in rapid succession of first, second, and third of shooting. And then after they fired, they were having to do all of this process of the powder, the musket ball, and packing it and shooting again. So then the British would go, and I mean, it's basically you were getting your rifle ready while being shot at. And then you'd be shooting, and they'd be getting their rifles ready, and it would be who could go the fastest to keep shooting back and forth. So it created this kind of sense of taking turns in fighting. The Continental Army was plagued with issues from the beginning, as I mentioned. one of those issues was the fact that people left to go home and help out. The other thing was that ultimately the British were far more disciplined because they had had a lot more years of experience fighting and doing this type of tactic. And I think that's part of the issue, which we'll see the militia just as like, yeah, we're not doing that crap. But is that you had the British Army, those that were in the British Army, they had been trained in these tactics and they'd been using them for a long-standing time. The colonists had not, and it is intimidating to sit there and kind of be in a line and watch that kind of chaos. And so you had in the Continental Army, which is what I won't write again because it's under that, is you did have soldiers that too often retreated before they should have. You even had generals that ordered the retreat. They felt that they were losing too many men when they really tactically shouldn't. And so that was a problem too, was not just the lack of discipline in this type of tactic, but they were going up against a far superior military structure when using this traditional style of fighting. The militia will be far more successful with the British in some aspects because they don't use traditional structure. And eventually, obviously, the Continental Army is successful, but it's really when they start getting creative with what to do. When George Washington was trained in the British Army, and so he followed those traditional tactics. And it really took a really rough winter and a decision to cross over and attack on Christmas, around Christmas, when normally in the winter, in kind of older battles and stuff, usually there was kind of this agreement, even if it wasn't spoken, that you took a break, not only for Christmas, but for the winter when it was really cold. You didn't fight because people didn't want to fight. They're like, look, can we all agree that this snow and cold sucks? And no one wants to fight during this time. And like, yeah, we don't either. Okay, cool. So we'll just take a break from the war and we'll have our winter break. And then when the weather's a little bit better, we'll come back and fight again. And that was done. And Washington ends up being forced out of desperation because they were starving and they were eating their horses to go on the offensive at a time when you didn't traditionally do so. So they caught the a supporting army. It wasn't the British, but it was supporting the Germans that were supporting them. And they were sleeping. So it was an easy win. But that kind of finally pushed them over the edge of having successful campaigns, and they changed their tactics. So, like I said, the traditional warfare, not so good. When they adapted their tactics slightly compared to the militia, but they did adapt them, then they were far more effective against the British. The other thing was, let's say, the military support and pay. So you don't have the not just the funds. They didn't have the funds to pay the soldiers, but they just didn't have the support line that a traditional military has, or even a military had like by the Civil War. So you were given very little when you signed up, or when you joined, when you were actually there, right? You got your first uniform and weapon, although a lot of people brought their own weapons as well. Outside of that, you had to pay for everything. So this included food, extra clothing, anything else you needed. There was no kind of supply line, and that is food being the number one thing, but clothing as well. These were the two big things. So that, like, everything, anything you wanted, you had to pay for besides that. But food and clothing are going to be the problems. And then the problem with all of that, right, is that the Continental Army, in part because of Congress being new and not really collecting taxes, did not have the funds to pay the soldiers. So they created this IOU system. They paid in what is script, basically. Script, or at least how script works, or IOUs. And this, the goal was that local merchants would take these. And then they're just paper that basically said that they were owed money, and it would be a specific amount based on their pay. And then right, and that's the big thing when this war started, with the Atlantic phase was not good for the colonists. The third phase is when we really start winning. But the Atlantic phase, if you were watching, you'd be like, oh yeah, they're totally going to lose. And so the merchants were like, why would I take this piece of paper that's like a gift card or gift certificate? But the problem is there's no money actually attached to it. And the plan was, if the colonists win, right, then at the end of war, you get paid what the script says, the amount on the script, and then there is interest paid for so many years. So you can actually see on the actual ones, they're still around today. That, like, there's still, you can find them occasionally, and it will have the name of the person and how much they were going to get paid. And then on the back, sometimes you see that person's name and over the years of where they're collecting their interest. Other times you see that person's name and then it shifts to someone else who bought it out from them, or they gave it to them. Other times you see the person's name that it was originated to, and then on the back it's a completely different name the whole time. And that actually, what happened with that is that the problem was the merchants said, well, you guys are losing, and I'm going to take this piece of paper and hope that maybe if you win, which is a big if, I'll get this money back. Otherwise, if you guys lose, I just gave away all of this free stuff, and I'm going to see nothing from it. And it was a big gamble. And so most of the merchants didn't accept them, even though that was the hope, right? So what happens is you have soldiers not getting paid, but having to provide for themselves, provide food and clothing, and also sometimes providing support back home too, right? That their wife might need some of the money because normally what they'd be working, they're not there to do, and in order for their family to survive, they need to do so. So this actually forced many soldiers to sell these to rich investors, we'll say, for pennies on the dollar. And those people made bank when the colonists actually won, right? But they had the money to gamble with it. These soldiers didn't. They were hungry. They couldn't buy food. They needed to support their families, and so they sold them. So when you see someone else's name on the back the whole time from the person that it was designated to, you know that was a soldier who sold it off for pennies on the dollar. And then the wealthy person could hold on to it, and it was an investment, and it was like playing the stock market, right? In the sense that you might make good money, or you might lose, but they had the money to gamble on that, where the soldiers did not. We're going to look at camp followers when we talk about women in the war, and they played a super essential role with this. So I'll just put the mention here, but we are going to come back and talk about how camp followers and women who did fundraising were essential. They are the only reason, really, that the Continental Army stayed together. Because without them, you probably would have had too many soldiers that just simply, even if they had wanted to go on, would not have been able to. So we'll come back and talk about them in more specific detail a little bit later. But that ultimately was a huge problem. So they had all of these problems that made it difficult to be successful. Okay, so the next, that was the official military of the Continental Congress, thus the Continental Army, and that was who was headed up by George Washington. Then you had State Militia. So each state also ended up informally setting up their own volunteer militia. So in a lot of these cases, they were not paid anything because it was a volunteer force. And there were a variety of reasons why they wouldn't join the Continental Army. For some, it was because they didn't want to. They're like, yeah, nope, I'm good. That doesn't seem, I don't actually want to be in the military. I want to fight and defend our land, but I'm not going to sign up for the military. So the thing was with it being a volunteer is that it allowed for freer movement. We'll say freedom of movement, in the sense of you could go home. Obviously, the Continental Army, some of the soldiers did, but not like the State Militia, who they came and went as they needed. So that was one of the other reasons to do this. Is they're like, well, I can't join the Continental Army because my wife and children need me on the farm, 3 months out of the year. And if I join up with the Continental Army, I won't be allowed to do that. Obviously, some still did, and they kind of ended up being able to do it. But there was potential for punishment and other things like that. So they said, well, but I want to fight, so I'm going to join the volunteer for the State Militia. And I'm volunteering, they're not paying me anything, so I can go leave, and then I'll come back when I'm done with the harvest. And then I'll go back, and help out with this, and then I'll come back and fight. And so it was much more informal. They didn't have to wear a uniform. They didn't do training and drills like the Continental Army. The other thing is that very quickly, I think they tried, a couple state militias tried once to do the formal style of fighting, and then immediately were like, yeah, screw that. That's not happening. And so they did a lot more, I guess informal fighting goes with more informal, but what was kind of like the hit and run tactics of fighting. And this was smart because they were much smaller in size and skill, right, than the British. So this was effective for their structure and against the British, who they were fighting, right? So how this worked is more like guerrilla warfare tactics than the formal fighting. The British hated it because the British felt like there were all these rules of war that gentlemen were supposed to follow. And so they actually, the British saw the militia as like, these are just the colonist brutes. And see, this is why they're not civilized. This is not, and they actually wrote a complaint and said, this is not proper warfare. This is not how we do things. and the militia's like, it's war. We can do whatever we want. The end is who wins, versus who followed the rules best. But what hit and run meant was, because they realized that traditional warfare against the British was a bad idea, and actually a lot of the tactics were borrowed from Native American style of fighting. So they had fought Native Americans, or they'd seen Native American style. They also had some Native Americans that helped and taught them how they fought. So it was a combination of how they learned. But what you did is that you would hide, or you would do surprise attacks. Let's see, I don't want to say it's always just surprise attacks, but that it was about attacking quickly and then retreating. Right, and also attacking when they didn't expect it. So one of the things that they did was, when the British were marching to whatever next destination they were doing, they would ambush them, right? So that could lead to this kind of ambush style of fighting. And then they would ambush them on the road, shoot at them, attack, and then disappear back into the woods. The other benefit that they had with this is that they tended to fight in their state or colony at this point, right? I said state, but it really is technically colonies that became states, but in their colony. And so they knew the area. Whereas the Continental Army went around to several different places. And if you know the area, it allows you to maneuver easier, to be able to set places that fight, that allow you better opportunities. And to the point where, like, they would attack, they would set the scene for, like, this is the best place to attack because the British don't have a wide open area. We can ambush them as they're marching through. We'll shoot at them. We'll attack, and then we will retreat and go and back into the forest or back into wherever. And they did often do that. That's the hit and run part, right? Attack, and then before the British could regroup and form any kind of strong resistance, then you retreat into the woods and they disappear. And the British weren't apt to chase them down far anyways, because that was so beyond how they normally fought. So this was super effective. And it really was important, I think, to have both tactics. That the Continental Army benefited from the militias, and the militias benefited from the Continental Army. Neither one probably could have done it on their own. You needed kind of both of these support systems. And if there wasn't one of them, it would have been a lot more. Well, the militia, it wouldn't have been successful. And the Continental Army would have had even a harder time, which would have made it even more unlikely for them to be successful. So this period with the second phase also has... let's see, so now we're on 4 here. Also, this was the overseas aid period, where there was the most attempts and pressure to bring the French into the war. I mean, and we were working the French force from, like, basically the Declaration of Independence. In fact, there were actually Lafayette was a French soldier who, even before the Declaration of Independence, was over in the colonies advising and interested in being involved. So there was looking for French aid, which took the form in money and weapons, if possible. But what we really wanted was soldiers to fight. So we were trying to convince them to come actually bring soldiers over and fight. We did sign and set up the model treaty out of this, which set up that the trade would be done with France as a favored nation. And what this means is that basically taxes and tariffs and things like that are favorable to both sides, and that you usually have exclusive trade deals that you don't have with other nations. And I mean, at this point we liked France a lot and didn't like the British. So, you know, the question is, why would France want to help us? Well, they did not like the British. So we didn't like the British at the time, which is funny because, right, we're much closer allies with the British now, and through most of U.S. history ended up becoming closer allies with the British than the French. And I'll explain why. We screw the French over when they have their own revolution. But why would the French want to help the colonists? Right, well, because they had, right, remember long battles or war with the British. You had the 9 Years' War, you had the War of Jingadir, you had the Spanish Succession War. Europe had a long history of fighting, and the French and the British were kind of natural enemies. So for the French, the benefit of helping the colonists was that, one, it took the colonies away from Britain, right? And so that alone would have been a financial incentive, because losing that was a significant financial loss to the British. Right, so it took the colonies, I said I wrote colonists, but that's fine, away. Let's just rewrite that since it's not working. From the British, which hurts them economically, and also it really was just a personal a personal desire to snub the British, like, haha, got you kind of thing. But it definitely had a connection to, right, the European conflicts that existed that way. We sent over several people. Thomas Jefferson was over in France. Benjamin Franklin was he was the most popular diplomat that went over. So that there were, like I said, Thomas Jefferson and others were there as diplomats, but Benjamin Franklin was extremely popular in France. He became like a mini celebrity, and he was a good speaker, and was it still took the French a while to help, but this did help influence the French decision to help. Right, and he actually spent a lot of time in the court with the King and Queen of France, right, because it was still a monarchy in France. And so he had to convince the King and Queen of the values of supporting the colonies. But he was apparently very popular with the ladies, and people followed him around. They even created a whole bunch of souvenirs, essentially, that they sold of his face, and they had like snuff boxes with his face on it. They sold wigs in the style of his hairstyle. Like, he was super, super popular. And he also went to a lot of parties during this time. But he did help with the model treaty. He did help persuade them. They were initially hesitant, obviously, to get too involved, because getting involved meant potentially having to go to war, even if you weren't fighting, right? So that they were even initially hesitant to provide anything, because if you do, right, this could get France into war with Britain. So they're like, well, it has to be worth it, because if we give you financial aid, let's say, then the British might, right, decide that we're helping too much and go to war. But right now we're not at war with them. And more importantly, it looked like the colonists were going to lose during this period. So they're also like, well, why should we get involved with you if you guys are going to lose? Because then that's just more likely that we help you out, you lose, and then we go to war with England, and then we've already done so many wars, right? You had those 4 wars that were extremely taxing, not just on the British, but on the French as well. So eventually, Benjamin Franklin and some of the others convinced him to help with, first helped with supplies and money. There were individuals like Lafayette that went over on their own accord and helped train the Continental Army. And so individual military men and advisors. There were a few that were also sent over by the king and queen. So you had these advisors, some that went over themselves, like, because Lafayette was there really early, and then they sent over official advisors. But they weren't... They didn't want to send over troops until they knew that we could actually win, or at least had a good shot of doing so. Eventually, France eventually sends soldiers, and that comes near the end of the war, but was super helpful and did play a tactical role at the very end. What actually convinced them was the Battle of Saratoga, where we had our first major victory. Right, this was it was seen as a turning point in the war, but it was also really that first major victory with an actual battle, right? You do have a few other smaller things, but this one they captured, like, and had a huge company of British soldiers surrender. And so that was the first one where it actually suggested that the colonists might actually have a chance at winning. And so once that happened, then you have the French start to send troops and plan for a joint attack. Because ultimately it benefited them if the British, like I said, lost the colonies. And it was just a personal, like, ha, screw you, British, French win kind of thing. So suggested colonists had a chance to win. Okay, so that's what was going on in the Mid-Atlantic region and phase. And again, that for most of I think that one of the other important things with it, right, is for most of that period in time, the colonists were not doing good tactically. in terms of fighting against the British. We were largely losing, and it wasn't until near the end of the Mid-Atlantic phase that was starting to turn around. And then you have the South or Southern region with the third phase, which was from 1778 to 1781. They definitely were two very different battles, periods, and how the battles were fought, and not just winning and losing. The South was far more vicious fighting. We'll say harsher fighting and destruction. And this definitely had issues to do with the Loyalists and that region. So the South, the British believed that the majority of the colonists in the South were Loyalists. And remember, so Loyalists are those who were supportive of the crown, and the Patriots were for the colonies and creating a new country, right? So Loyalists they stayed loyal to the British, and Patriots were colonists who supported the revolution. So you'll hear those terms a lot. So there were more Loyalists in the South, so that one, you had the British focus, let's say, occupation in southern regions, because they wanted, it wasn't the only area. They obviously started more in the mid-Atlantic area and New York. So the East Coast, they did start with the East Coast. The William Howe's troops invaded New York, but they started actually having stations in the South because of feeling that the Loyalists were in higher concentration in that area. There were problems with this. One is that, and the British constantly had to deal with this, you can't tell who is a Loyalist by looking at them, right? There was no clear, that's a Loyalist and that's not. So the benefit of this for the colonists, for the Patriots, was that it was easier to be a spy. It was still dangerous, because being a spy, if you got caught, you were executed. There was a whole spy ring created during this time, and it's pretty crazy. Because of these spy rings, there was a ton of invented tactics for spying. One of the things that they did is that they had, when they could, right, Patriots, they're all colonists. Patriots pretend to be Loyalists, so they could stay over on that side and get information. The British do they end up getting much harsher about who could go where without specific written guarantees of Loyalist sentiment. So that became harder and harder as time went on, but that was one of the things that they could do. You also used women and slaves who were largely ignored by the British for quite some time. And that's part of that view of that women, because of femme covert, which was once you got married, that your political identity, married women's political identity, or even just their identity, right? Married women's identity was their husbands. So there was this belief that women didn't have their own political viewpoints and things like that, so they weren't going to get involved. Plus, also that the political realm or the political sphere was male, so of course women weren't going to be involved in that. And then for slaves, of course, right, they weren't free. So if you weren't free, you didn't have your own political identity or capability. So they were able to slip in and out even easier. They would sew messages inside their dress. And of course, the British soldiers weren't going to pat down women at checkpoints. That would have been an uproar by both sides. And they later started employing women to stand at the checkpoints to check women's clothing when they were suspicious of them, when they started realizing that women were helping out. You also, like, at the rim of their hat, you would have slaves that would overhear, because they're serving these British soldiers, and they would overhear what they're talking about, and then they would write the important notes and information and sew it into a shirt and then have it sent somewhere, to which then a Patriot spy would pick it up and get the information. Kids were occasionally used too, because they were also seen as not spies, and of course they weren't executed if they were young enough. And they would sew. So sewing stuff into clothes was a common one. They also had you had vinegar and the egg. We'll say eggs for notes, and what else are they called? The cryptics, I think. And we'll say specialized locks boxes. I don't know the specific name. I think it's cryptics. What they kind of looked like was this, and then it had a combination, little spinny things. So it had a little cap on the end, and then you would put the note, you'd put the note would go inside. And then they weren't usually numbers, but I'll just put numbers so you can see. So it's kind of like a combination lock. But they had, you didn't just do numbers, like you did symbols or you did the alphabet, and you spun them around and the right combination opened it up. And you had to have the cipher to really be able to figure these out, because you could create ones that were even more than just 4 turn things, which gave so many infinite numbers of possibilities and options that it was unrealistic that anyone who didn't have the cipher and the code, right, that basically it required a code to figure out the combination. And if you didn't have that, the likelihood of you figuring it out was unlikely. The eggs, they would actually use vinegar. And so you would write on you'd hard boil an egg and then write on the shell in vinegar, which would go through and turn it, kind of the egg where the writing was, into brown, so you could read notes. And the convenient thing with that is you could eat it real fast if you needed to dispose of the evidence. And so they'd have people that would be delivering eggs, and they'd have a bunch of eggs that had nothing, and then a couple eggs that had important notes. So even if they got checked and someone took an egg, they could position it so that the likelihood of them taking the eggs with vinegar was very unlikely. Or you could quickly eat it if you needed to. But then the person who received it would peel off the shell and they could read the writing underneath. They also used books with codes and ciphers as well. And lots of other things. Like there were, like, you could think of the idea of like modern spycraft started here. And the problem was, right, is that you didn't always know who was a loyalist and who was a spy. The loyalists didn't always want to speak up either, because this created a lot of tension between loyalist and patriot. And of course, in the areas that were British controlled, the loyalists didn't have problems. But if you spoke up as a loyalist, but you were in an area that the British didn't control, loyalists made up about 20% of the population. And if they spoke up and they were in an area where, like I said, they weren't secure, they were often, even the women. So sometimes if they were a Loyalist family, the husband would go fight with the British soldiers and the wife and child would stay home. And men were often, that were Loyalists, were often beat up and kicked out of the town. But women and children, so the wife and children, were often removed from their house. They actually passed laws that they were able to confiscate their property, so their house and land. And this was a big one. That was people's livelihood. That had gone back in families for, years. And people didn't want to lose that income and that connection to their land and their property. And so some Loyalists didn't speak up or do anything, even if they personally felt that the British were in the right, because they didn't want to have their property and land and livelihood and everything confiscated. Others, hoped that if their wife and children were there, even if they weren't there anymore, that they would be allowed to stay. But almost all that were known Loyalists were removed, and men often were beaten up if they was found to be a Loyalist in these areas. And then ultimately, long term, right at the end of war with the Loyalists, you had they were forced to leave. So even if you held on to your property, the United States, right, at the end of the war, you were forced to leave. So there were two places you could go, England or Canada. The wealthy went to England because that was more desirable, but it was more expensive and harder to do. Those who were not as wealthy went to Canada because they were able to make it up there. The interesting thing is that most of the people who went to England were viewed as traitors by the English, even though they technically were English themselves, right? And had a harder time in society. But many didn't come back once they were able to, because it was super expensive. After 5 years, the Loyalists were allowed to come back. And so more people came back that went to Canada came back. Although obviously people still stayed in Canada. It's why today, and that's, you have an impact from that. Canada is connected to the British Crown, and seen as in part a province or connected region to the British. And that was because of all of the Loyalists who went and lived there, plus some of the British who moved there. There's obviously a French connection as well. But so after 5 years, Loyalists were allowed to come back, and easier to do from Canada. So you really had some significant things. Of course, they didn't know about the end of the war, and that they were going to have to leave. They were obviously expecting the British to win. Nonetheless, the Loyalists, especially women and children that weren't always, I'll put that too here. Women and children, the women didn't always agree, or at least in public, didn't agree with their husbands. And there were women who sued the courts to get their property back after the war. Right? They said, look, our property, my house and land was confiscated because my husband was a Loyalist. So their husband fought for the British, but their claim was that they they claimed that they were patriots. There were like 3 women that did this, at least, that I have read about, claimed they were patriots. And they said, I have taught the children to be patriots. And not only that, but I did not speak or communicate with my husband after he left, right? So he took off, and then I cut him off. I basically said we still had nothing to do with husband after the war. Like, he went back to England, and we're still here. And so they tried to make their case that they were patriots, and saying, like, look, everything we've done, we have all this proof that we're patriots. And while my husband was a loyalist, yes, we were not. And the court said doesn't matter because of femme covert. Right, because you cannot have a political identity of your own. Once you're married, you are a loyalist if your husband's a loyalist. Doesn't matter your actions, it doesn't matter what you do. If your husband was a loyalist, you're a loyalist. And so these women, lost everything and had to move. They were ones that were more likely to come back. But there were families and men as well. But I think it was especially difficult for women who not only had to face all of this and trying to keep things together for their children, but women who were actually not loyalists, who were punished as loyalists because of the femme covert law. Now, besides this, you also have the type of fighting and conditions. So, okay, we're on 5 here. The fighting in the South, or here we'll put conditions because it was not just fighting. The conditions in the South were far, like I said, harsher fighting. You had more food shortages in the South because of that, more destruction. You also had more violence outside of battles, not just with the Loyalists. One of the more brutal treatment of civilians, what took place in the South. Violence outside the battles. And so the civilian impact was definitely far more involved. And then just the social tensions between colonists was harsher. But the battles were definitely bloodier. So we'll put that too. And then battles, higher death rate. So the South definitely had a much harsher experience with fighting. There was some more street fighting stuff too that took place. This is the phase where the French military joins the war and ultimately helps lead to the end of war and the surrender of the British. So while the Continental Army and the militia were doing better, and definitely it was a turning point with the South as far as wins, it was super helpful to have the British Navy. They specifically came in and helped with naval battles and tactics. And one of the last battles with Yorktown, helping specifically cut off the British Navy from resupplying, which was very important in us being able to win. So resupplying the troops with more troops and provisions and things like that. So we were able to like cordon them off and separate them from having any reinforcements come in because of the help of the French. Okay, so those are the different phases of war. I talked a little bit with the Loyalists within that culture, but I want to look at society and culture next, during, we'll say, culture of war. So I'm not going to rewrite about the Loyalists, but I'm just going to list them, right? That the Loyalist and conditions, right? That was one. The next were the Quakers. So the Quakers were a religious group, and they were pacifists. So they did not believe in fighting at all. No fighting. They actually had their own community before and during the Revolutionary War, but that actually ended because of really what happened with the Revolutionary War. So ended after the war, not all at once, but it did start the process. So they were vilified essentially on each side. They refused to fight. Although many were supportive of the Patriots, they also helped any wounded soldiers. So whether they were Loyalist or British or Patriot, they helped out. So both sides looked at them as traitors. And this led to people being beaten up. This also led to towns being burned down. So they really experienced hate and attacks from both sides. They didn't have any, the Patriots or the Loyalists or the British, who looked on them favorably and supported them. And because of the attacks on their communities and towns, it led to the decline of Quakers. But they were willing to help out whoever was wounded. And they often said, like, well, we support the Patriots, but we can't fight because of our religion. The Quakers themselves as a religion did not die. So when we talk about like the abolition movement, Lucretia Mott, Angelina and Sarah Grimsky, some of the most well-known women rights movement and abolitionists, they were Quakers. So just to make sure that's clear, like the religion did not die. The communities where you had a full town that was all just Quakers, that went away. Let's see. Own community ended after the war. We'll say, but oops, the power cord went off here. Let me put that back in for a second. So that went away after the war, but not the religion. But that still was a significant loss in terms of having the community and town that they had set up that had been around for a long time to end because of that. Next, you have African Americans and both free black population and slaves. With the free black population, you had this decision that had to be made of who to support, right? And we'll see this with Native Americans as well. And that really came down to looking at, who could provide liberty and freedom and equal rights, ideally, as well. Was kind of the hope. That was weird. We had like a glitch there while writing. And there was cases to be made. Give us a second to think. There we go. Oh. There were cases to be made for both sides. Okay, well, let's see if we can get one note here to stop freaking out. There we go. You have the language of the Patriots, right, which was freedom, liberty, equality, the end of tyranny, and even the use of slavery in terms of the king and the British and that type of stuff. So when you have this like language of freedom and equality and against tyranny and slavery, there were many who were hopeful, who, like I said, obviously saw the connection to this language and slavery. One, of course, the hypocrisy of it, but also, so there were two things with this. One was the fact that they this doesn't go, the language doesn't go with slavery. And so for some, it was just pointing out the hypocrisy. Others, it was then the hope that this would mean change. And some supported the British and decided to fight for the British, thinking that the colonists were not going to change. And others who supported at the beginning the Patriots because of this language and the hope that, like I said, that it would be there. We have in Voices of Freedom, one of the readings is with Phyllis Wheatley. Actually, let me write her name and then we'll look at that. So a good example of this is Phyllis Wheatley. She was a slave and then also a poet, and she wrote letters to several people, reverends. She was also an ardent Christian, as well as poems. So this is a drawing of her, and this one was to a reverend, and this is one that's in Voices of Freedom that I had you guys read, and she points out in this, and actually several of her poems, several of her letters, she points out that kind of hypocrisy and the language of why, if this is the language, that this hope, the hope that it would get connected to the end of slavery. And so she writes that she's happy with the fact of that he was offering vindication of natural rights of Black people. Those that invade them cannot be insensible that the divine light is chasing away the thick darkness which broods over the land of Africa, and the chaos which has reigned so long is converting into beautiful order and reveals more and more clearly the glorious dispensation of civil and religious liberty, which are so inseparably limited that there is little or no enjoyment of one without the other. So she's saying, right, that he hopes that, one, thanks him for talking about natural rights of Black people, but then hoping also that they're recognizing, right, that this idea of civil and religious liberty are not only important, but that both are combined. And she did have a importance with the view of religious liberty because she was very religious. But then this is like being a little bit snarky with it, right? Otherwise, perhaps the Israelites would have been less solicitous for their freedom from Egyptian slavery, right? So if civil and religious liberty were not connected and important, then the Israelites wouldn't have been so desirous of being free from the Egyptians. So that, right, she's saying, look, they obviously wanted to be free. We'll say they would not have cared to be slaves. Would not have cared if they were slaves. So she's like, right, they were desperate to not be slaves. And they tied it to their religion, but also the importance of civil liberty. And obviously, if these are tied, right, then if this wasn't so important, we wouldn't have seen in the Bible how the Israelites wanted to be free of slavery. I do not say that they would have been contented without it, by no means. For every human being, or every human breast, God has implanted a principle which we call love of freedom. It is impatient of oppression and pants for deliverance. And by the laws of our modern Egyptians, I can speak, I will assert that the same principles live in us. Modern Egyptians, right, that's slave owners / colonists. God grant deliverance in his own way and time. She says, this I desire not for their hurt, but to convince them of the strange absurdity of their conduct, whose words and actions are so diametrically opposite. So that's the hypocrisy there. She's like, look, I just want to make it clear that these colonists are claiming liberty, freedom, equality, freedom from tyranny and slavery of the British Empire. And yet they have slaves. Like, how does that work together? How well the cry for liberty and the reverse disposition for the exercise of oppressive power over others agree. I humbly think it does not require the penetration of a philosopher to determine. So she's saying, right, then not only is this like how I just want them to understand you guys are being you're being hypocritical here, but that she ends it with this idea of, right, how strong the cry of liberty and the desire to not be under oppressive power. It doesn't take a philosopher to figure this out, is what she's saying. She's like, it shouldn't take a philosopher to figure this out. Obviously, and there is some hope in that too. Like, if they're using this language and promoting this, maybe they'll figure it out and realize that what they're saying here applies to us as well. And that's what a lot of people started doing, is that connecting it to, right, the language of slavery, the slavery and the language of the revolutionaries, and trying to specifically use the language of revolutionaries to promote the end of slavery. And there were, besides Phyllis Wheatley, who did the poems and letters and spoke about it, you had others who petitioned the government. So you had, we'll just put it here, petitions to governments for the freedom of slaves. And again, specifically using that language to try to do so. So, like I said, there definitely was, and there wasn't full agreement over, who to support and ultimately what the outcome would be. And then you had the experience with slaves, and what that meant for them. Now, there was a small, percentage of plantation slave owners. So those in the South, right? Because the North, well, they had some slaves, they weren't plantation based, who freed their slaves. And there are two reasons for this. One, because they did connect the language and beliefs of the Patriots and how that connected in connection to slavery. Stop deleting here. There we go. OneNote's freaking out today. Keeps not responding. It's like, don't disappear on me here. So the connection in language and the beliefs of the Patriots, we'll say, and slavery. The others freed the slaves because they thought it was going to happen anyways. So some it was because they truly believed that that was no longer correct. And others were just like, well, this is going to happen anyway because of that language and the how things were being said. And so they freed that. But that was a small percentage. One of the other things you're going to have is, of course, gradual abolition in the North when the war is over. So what's going to happen is that the northern states are slowly going to implement gradual abolition once the war is over. Gradual abolition, and we'll talk more about it when we get to the abolition movement. But the big thing is that you had a time limit, so it usually was 5 to 10 years, where it said within 5 to 10 years all slaves freed. So it was not immediate. There was compensation for slave owners, and again, not everyone followed this exactly. This generally tended to be what gradual abolition was. This did include usually that children born during this time, or who turned 18 before the 5 to 10 year period were freed, and then not full citizens. So again, this isn't always exactly each state did gradual abolition slightly different, generally speaking. But what this led to, right, is that because of the Revolutionary War, northern states eventually ended up free states. And this started right after the Revolutionary War, because many of the ardent patriots and Revolutionary War supporters were from the North. And so that contradiction and hypocrisy that came in with the language happened to be more impactful to them than those who were like, well, sure, I support it, or didn't support it. And the other thing, of course, with the North was that they weren't plantation-based systems. So you had slaves, but they were house slaves, or they had, specific skills like a blacksmith or something like that. It was easier to free slaves and not have it be as significant of a fight, claiming it was connected to their society and way of life and economic well-being. Where the plantation-based systems, those were much more resistive because that was so interconnected in those ways, especially as time went on. It got more and more interconnected up through right to the Civil War. Then you had also that one of the consequences of the Revolutionary War is it made escape from slavery, I don't know if easier, but it gave them more options. So one was just because of the chaos of warfare. It became easier to run away and not get caught. It also created a specific place to run away to. Actually, for women and children, it provided more of an opportunity. So women and children did not run away as often as men in normal times, because it was easier to catch children, right? They can't run as fast, they can't go as long. If it's a baby, they cry, they get caught, and women were less likely to leave their children behind on the plantation. So women typically ran away less than men. But during the Revolutionary War, more women than ever before, and children, escaped slavery because it gave them an easier time because of the chaos, or because of fighting, or because the slave owner was not present because they were fighting. And so it gave them an actual opportunity, and they took it. You also had a location to run away to. So that was a big part of it, right? Prior to the Revolutionary War, where do you go? There aren't a lot of free black societies and communities. When the North becomes free, that was another huge uptick in people running away, because now you had all of the North to escape to be free. But prior to that, there weren't a lot of places where you could run away and not easily get caught because you stood out, and there wasn't, a large free black community to go to, or the few that were there, they knew to look there for you. So the specific location that gave away is that the British used this to try to destabilize the economy. Let's just say weaken, since I apparently can't write there. Okay. So they used it to weaken the economy. What they offer, they believe, right, if we can get all the plantation slaves to escape, then that will hurt the economy. And maybe they'll be focused on that and, I don't know, not fight as much. But what they offered is that slaves, they didn't offer to help them escape, but slaves who escaped and made it to British lines, right, to the British side. Once they did that, if they helped with the war effort, so this meant for men fighting and women cooking and cleaning and kind of doing stuff around the camp, then would be freed after the British win, which of course they don't win, so that becomes problematic. Because the British lose, so after the war, there were a variety of things that happened. One is some were freed, were taken to England. If they were lucky, they were taken to England and they were free there because they didn't have the slavery, and they were freed. Others were dropped off along the way. And this varied in success. Some were dropped off on an island, and there was not really a way to survive. Others were dropped off in places where they could survive, and then others were sold back into slavery after the war. Some were just left by the British and were captured and put back into slavery. Some British soldiers actually sold back those who had run away into slavery as well. So it didn't work out well because the British ultimately didn't win. But it was an opportunity, and many took it. And I think again shows very clearly the example of a desire to be free and not wanting to be slaves. Okay, so that's with African Americans and both free black community and slaves. The next group we want to look at are Native Americans. So much like with the free black population, you had to have a decision about. Stop doing that. One note. about who to support, right? So the question was who to support, who is most likely to respect treaties and Native American land. Now, this was not easily decided. It actually split the Iroquois Confederacy. They were the Iroquois Confederacy was multiple tribes. It was the largest group of Native Americans at the time, and it kind of split it down the middle. And that was unfortunate because then it made them have less defensible options when the colonists won and started taking over their territory. And so you have both. You have some that side with the British and some that side with colonists. And almost always it was based on who they thought would provide them that freedom after the war. So you have it fought on both sides. Women played an important role in this because there were often women who were married to either the colonist. I seriously I don't think I've ever had OneNote act up this much before. I'm going to have to restart the computer after this because it clearly is not happy with me. Come on. Delete. There we go. Okay. If I can get through the rest of this lecture. We're getting there. We're almost done. Married colonists or British, often British officers. And so they were looked to by their tribes to provide information on, would they do what they said? Who should we support on each side? And the women often advised on what they thought would be the best thing for the tribes. Like, yeah, well, I've heard my husband talking and this is their plan. Or that they tend to respect treaties, or that they're going to leave us alone. Or, yeah, no, they're not going to leave us alone. After the war, of course, it was pretty much devastating because you have the systematic removal of the Native American tribes because the colonists wanted land. Well, the Americans at this point. And there was no respect for tribal territory, past treaties, right? This is when you also are going to have westward expansion, just immediately go out. And that's going to lead to eventually the Indian Removal Act, which we'll talk about with Andrew Jackson. And then actual bounties for people to kill Indians. They actually paid people for scalps in order to take the land. So it was devastating. The end of the war, slavery doesn't disappear. And those slaves were not freed. And for Native Americans, it was devastating because they lost their land and any chance of really retaining autonomy. And we'll see for women, they did not get the rights that they were looking for. One of the earliest things that we see with women is within Abigail Adams. And that women from the very start of the United States wanted the right to vote and wanted to have more acknowledgement in the code of laws, as she said. But one of the things, we're going to look at her letter. Come on, I'm almost done here. Let me get through the last of this. So women from the start wanted the right to vote. And we see this with Abigail Adams and her letter to her husband. And she's going to ask for voting and recognition in law codes. And he's going to respond not only by... So here, let's put John Adams responds. John Adams responds with laughing and saying he would hope they would fight everyone, all men, would fight against it. Okay, so let's look at, and specifically his words are important and how he says it. But like I said, the importance of that there was this, they wanted the right to vote. They wanted to be included. So when the Declaration of Independence was happening and they're setting up stuff, she wrote to her husband. So before the war, right? Or right at the precipice of war, she was writing to him with, like, I've heard that this is what your guys are going to do, right? I long to hear that you have declared independency. And by the way, in the new code of laws, I suppose it will be necessary for you to make. I desire you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. So she's going to use that Revolutionary War language too, just like the others had done. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation, right? So right there, she's asking for voice and representation. What's right? She's totally using the language of the Declaration of Independence here. That we don't have to be bound by laws that don't have us have a voice or representation. So she's threatening her own rebellion. You know, you guys are planning on throwing this rebellion. Well, if you don't include us, we don't feel the need to be bound by those laws because we have no voice or representation here. That your sex are naturally tyrannical is truth, so thoroughly established as to admit of no dispute. But as such of you wish to be happy, willingly give up the harsh title of master, again, that language, for the more tender and enduring one of friend. Why then not put it out of the power of the vicious and lawless to use us with cruelty and indignity with impunity? So this is funny, right? The first part is like a threat, right? This is kind of a threat here. So what she wants, and then a threat, and then this is like the sweet talk, right? Look, so first she does that threat. Then she's like, look, we already know that men are tyrannical, but most of you wish to be happy. So you willingly, on your own accord, give up the title of master for friend, right? That's what good husbands and men do. But so if you're already doing that, why not just put it in the laws so that those men who are lawless and mean don't take advantage and abuse us? So she first goes, we're going to throw a rebellion if you don't include us in because we don't have representation and a voice. But also, we know like that you guys have chosen, the good men have chosen to not keep that title of master and they're our friend. And you're already practicing it, so just put it in the law. So it's kind of that funny, that progression. He's going to do it too. So they go from like straightforward and kind of like threats, and then it's like the argument of trying to convince the other. So he writes back, right? As to your extraordinary code of laws, I cannot but laugh. So this is what I think is important. Not only that it shows that women like Abigail Adams were already pressing for this, and she wasn't the only one. His response is important too. We're going to look at the wording he chooses. It's really significant in showing how opposed to women and social change He was. We have been told that our struggle has loosened the bands of government everywhere. And then he lists groups: Native Americans, apprentices, children, slaves. They've all been disobedient, students in colleges and stuff. So he's basically like, look, obvious, and it is all of these groups of people heard the language of liberty, freedom, and equality and wanted that to apply to themselves. And so he starts off by saying, well, basically, I laughed when I read your letter, but then we have heard that our move towards independency has loosened the bands of government everywhere. So he's not seeing it as a positive. One of the things that's important, the Revolutionary War was revolutionary in terms of political change. The idea that, let's put that on here too. The idea that the king didn't have a God-given inherited right to be in charge. So the revolutionary ideas of the Revolutionary War, the political change, specifically against kingship, and change to democracy, or an attempt at democracy, right? We'll look at how that works. But where you see no revolutionary change, and this is sometimes misconstrued, that the revolution changed this. No social revolution. The revolutionary founding fathers like John Adams, Hamilton, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington did not want social change. They did not. Social change was bad, right? This was bad. They didn't like it. They're like, no, we want the status quo. There was no revolutionary component of social change that took place in the Revolutionary War. There is a slight change for women, but it's not revolutionary. It's just small little steps. But for all these other groups that he just listed, right, that was seen as bad. Oh, why would we want that? The wealthy and landowners are supposed to be the ones running the government. Y'all peons over there shouldn't be getting a say. And why are you all challenging us now? And you're like, duh. I mean, we saw with Phyllis Wheatley, right? You're using the language, stupid. Can you not see how it coincides? So I wanted to point that out because a lot of times people will talk about how the Revolutionary War was so revolutionary, right? It's in the name. It's revolutionary. It made all these changes. And you're like, politically, yes. The idea that a king doesn't have inherent God-given right to rule just because of that was more revolutionary. Looking to try to form a democracy that would run, that was revolutionary. Socially, no, don't change anything. We like our status where it is, and we do not want to give anyone else underneath us any type of freedom or power or equality. Yes, there were individuals who freed their slaves. Yes, there were individuals who supported women having the right to vote and representation. But as a whole, the major founding fathers were not very revolutionary with social change. And then as a group together, absolutely not at all. But your letter was the first intimation that another tribe, more numerous and powerful than the rest, had grown discontented, right? So there he's acknowledging that all of these groups were discontent. And that's, of course, the other tribe was women, which is 50% of the population. So, yes, the most numerous out of all these groups. This is rather too coarse a compliment, but you were so saucy, I won't blot it out. Blotted out is erasing, but without erasing, right? They're writing with quill and ink. You can't erase. So if you write something that's a mistake or you don't want in there, you blot it out by putting ink all over it so they can't read it. So he's basically saying, it's too coarse a compliment, but you're so saucy, I won't erase it. We know better than to repeal our masculine systems. Although they are in full force, you know they're a little more than theory. We dare not exert our power in its full latitude. We are obliged to go fair and softly in practice. You know we are the subjects. We only have the name of masters. So here is his sweet talk. Right? he's like, he does the threat after. Okay, so here's his sweet talk. We know better than to repeal our masculine systems. They're not in full force. Look, they're just theory. You know, we all don't bother or dare to exert the power we supposedly have. We have to go fair and softly, and in practice, you know that we are the subjects and you're the masters, right? The wife is always the master. So it's already happening. But we're not going to give up the actual title, because he says if we would, rather than give up this which would completely subject us to the despotism of the petticoat. So he's arguing, like, look, we're going to keep our title of master, but we're the subjects in practice. But if we gave up the title of master, we'd be subject to the despotism of the petticoat. Despotism means cruel rule. Cruel and harsh rule. Okay? Petticoat was a part of a woman's clothing. It was what's wrapped around part of the skirt. So cruel. So he's saying, if we gave up the title of masters officially, we would be subject to the cruel and harsh rule of women. That's what he's saying. But this is what's worse. Sorry, I dropped my pen. His whole thing is, stop that. His whole thing, oh my gosh, my computer is freaking out today. Okay, his whole thing here at the end, I'm going to erase these lines so we can see it. I hope General Washington and our brave heroes would fight. I am sure every good politician would plot as long as he would against despotism, empire, monarchy, aristocracy, oligarchy, and autocracy. A fine story indeed. Then it sounds like he's chuckling again at the end here, right? All these words, these are important. Despotism, empire, monarchy, aristocracy, oligarchy. So, this is despotism is cruel and harsh rule. Empire and monarchy are often tied together. Monarchy is kingship. Empire is like controlling outside of just your state, but almost always empire was connected to monarchy. Aristocracy is rule of the nobility. Oligarchy is rule of the few. And the last one is mob rule. Okay, so these are all dirty words to the Patriots. These are all the he just listed the worst of the worst words of rule you could think of. And he's saying to her, not only like would we be subject to the despotism of the petticoat, but I hope that George Washington, General Washington, and everyone else, all of the Patriots, would fight against giving up our title of masters as hard as we would fight against these horrible types of rule. That's really harsh. Like, to sit there and say that basically to give women representation in the voice is as bad as despotism, aristocracy, oligarchy, etc., etc. That's what he's saying. And it certainly shows why it takes women so long to be able to get any type of rights and representation, right? So we have from 1776 clear examples, including Abigail Adams, of women saying, yeah, we want the right to vote and representation. It takes till 1920 for women to get the right to vote, and really longer for black women, even if it officially was part of the federal government. So, I mean, that's what's crazy with this, is it's a great for showcasing not only that women were pushing for this early on, but like his response to his wife is really kind of harsh in the terms of how he's saying, I'm equating your idea of having a representation and voice to these evil, dirty words of rule of governments. I see it as that bad. So much so that I would hope we'd all fight against it. So I think it's really enlightening into kind of men's view of women and their role, especially within the political spectrum. Now, during the war, there's a few things that women did that I want to look at. There were, the first one was for more wealthier women, which was fundraisers. So women who were living in urban areas or were wealthier wanted to help out with the war effort by raising funds. They raised money initially, but then switched to food and clothing. And then these were given to, right, the soldiers, the Continental Army. Now, the money, what actually happened with that is that they actually set up ladies' associations for fundraising, and they bought out a warehouse to store the food, and they made clothing. They sewed sweaters and socks. They actually knitted their name on the tag so the men could see it, give a name attached to this woman. Made this for you. Martha Washington, George Washington's wife, and several other leading ladies, women that were married to some of the founding fathers, created a fundraising group and a women's association, and they went around and collected money. They were successful, so much so that they collected enough money to give $2 to every single Continental soldier, which is a big deal. $2 was a good amount back then, plus to give $2 to every Continental soldier, let's say 19,000 or less, that's a lot of money. And so Martha, because she was married to George Washington, goes up to him and is like, hey, yeah, we raised this money for you. We know you guys have a problem with not paying your soldiers and they're desperate to buy food. We want $2 to go to each soldier directly. And he was like, yeah, no, not going to happen. He claimed that he didn't want him to do that because the soldiers would just buy it on alcohol and waste it. So he said, you can give it to me and I will distribute it as needed to the military. And Martha and her friends went, no, absolutely not. We raised this. We get to decide what we do with this. And he's like, well, I'm in charge of the military, so I get to decide where the money goes. And so they got so pissed, they said, fine, we're not giving it to you. We don't have to. And they went and they used the money to buy food and stored food in the warehouse that then they were able to distribute to the men, because they wanted it to go directly to the men. They didn't want it to go to the institution of the military that may or may not benefit the men. They said, we did this because we know they're hurting and they need help. There's no guarantee they're going to get that, which is kind of harsh to say to your husband. I don't trust that you're not going to keep this money. Are you going to pocket this money, George? Because, you know, I just don't trust you with that. It was more that she wanted control. They raised it. They wanted control. And they felt like there was a direct need for the soldiers, which there was. And so that you know, since you're not paying them, George, how about, I mean, it wasn't really his responsibility, it was Congress. But in my head, it's like, well, you're not paying your soldiers, so why would you not want us to give them the money? But yeah, so they took control. They ended up getting a warehouse, buying a bunch of food, buying some clothes, but they made a lot of clothes, blankets, and socks, things that were needed. And then distributed that directly to the soldiers. This was super important. Remember, I talked about the Continental Army did not have a supply line. You got the most basic things when you signed up, and then you were responsible for buying your own food and clothes as needed. But the Continental Army was only paying in these IOUs most of the time. So they didn't have the money and resources to purchase these things. So that was essential to the success, along with camp followers. Camp followers were, so like I said, the fundraisers were more the wealthy women and urban, those that lived in the cities. Camp followers tended to be rural or country and poorer. These were women and children that could not survive without their husband around. And what that means, right, is that they were poor enough that they lived on whatever basically that their husband could manage to do with farming or work. And with him not there to earn that money or that living, they were going to be destitute. So they did what it says. They followed the Continental Army around and camped nearby. George Washington complained about them, but they played a vital role, even more than the fundraisings, to the success of the army, because they ended up providing essential services. They provided food and cooked and cleaned. And cooked was what cooked cleaned. They cleaned the camp. Cleaning the camp was essential for not having disease and infection. They washed clothes and mended them. They also were nurses, unofficial. It's going to take to the Civil War for women to be accepted as official nurses, but they would jump in when needed. They also, besides cleaning the camp, cleaned the hospital, which also was huge, and bandages. They provided comfort and wrote letters for sick and dying soldiers. They also provided the moral support for their husbands, for husbands and fathers, right? Many of the Continental soldiers probably would have left if their wives and children had not been there. So being able to see him at the end of the day, being able to see him after a battle, and some helped out during the battle, unofficially. You had one woman, her name was Molly Pitcher, and, we talked about this type of battle and stuff. She went around and she provided water, had like a bucket of water, and gave water to the men during longer battles. Of course, she wasn't in the front line, but those that were on cannons, those that were in the back, those that were injured and brought back, it was tiring and made you thirsty and dehydrated. And so she gave water to the men that needed it. Others were taught their husband's role, their husband's job. So, for example, one woman was taught how to load the cannon and fire it. Her husband was manning the cannons. He gets shot during the battle. They weren't, again, not the front line because it was the cannons. She stepped in and continued firing that cannon until the battle was over. So these women became temporary, we'll call them temporary soldiers, temporary fighters, as needed. Besides all of these other things. Like I said, none of this would have been successful if you didn't have the camp followers and the fundraisers. And then lastly, which was a much smaller group, but still important to acknowledge, were fighters. Women who felt like they were really wanted to help and that the Revolutionary War was important. And so much so that they disguised themselves as men and fought. Again, this was a small number comparatively, but it shows that their desire, that they felt that it was important for them to help out, and this was what they saw as the best way to do so. And the Civil War women will do this again. Well, probably the most well-known was Deborah Sampson. She... it has a P in there. She disguised herself as a man, and right, there's no ID and stuff that way in checks. And so she disguised herself as a man and went in and fought, and the name of the man that she fought under had super good commendations. Everyone talked about how great of a soldier he was. She gets shot in the leg, and trying to avoid being discovered, digs the bullet out herself and tries to keep fighting. It ends up getting infected, musket balls often did, and she ends up collapsing, and when they take her to the hospital, the doctor discovers she's a woman. She's discharged. After she heals, she disguises herself as a man and goes and enlists in a different company to continue fighting. So it was smaller compared to camp followers and fundraisers, but there were women who who disguised themselves and were willing to risk their lives to fight for the Revolutionary War. Now, on the home front, you had what were called deputy husbands. And deputy husbands it was a title. It was a specific title that was given. And this was for largely women who stayed to either run the business or the farm. But what's important is in part this title to it, that they had to give this title, right? It essentially, again, here we go. So it was for women who ran the farm or business while the husband was away at war. Come on. Okay, so let's break down the title. You have deputy, which is temporary status and helper, right? Deputies are usually deputized or secondary to the main person. And then you have husband, right? So they had to be named. It's the role of male head of the household. So women, in order to get past femme covert, right, because this was very much about subverting temporarily femme covert, because they had no legal rights to property, to business, to money. But they had to then be given a male title that was head of the household, right, husband, in order to do this. That's how crazy that role was, right, is that they ultimately were doing that. And then they became responsible. You know, they ran the businesses while their husbands were gone. And there was various levels of success. Some women wrote their husbands and were like, yeah, things are failing, because there was price gouging in areas. And just difficulty with, they were, paying employees, paying to have new employees come in, hiring and firing, selling their product, making contracts, all things that women could not do under femme covert, which is why they had to have the official title. This was an official title of deputy husband. Essentially, you are a temporary man. That's what it means. You are a temporary man while your husband is gone, so you can have control of these things. But they ran all of that. What's interesting with this is, so some failed. Some wrote their husbands were like, you need to come home. The business is failing, or this is happening and I can't do this. But we also saw a lot of women, a transformation in how both the men and the women respond to things. So we have several early letters between husband and wife. In the early letters, the women would write, when they're sharing what's going on, your farm or your business. So they'd be writing to their husband, right? And it was the idea of, they identified it as their husbands. It's your farm, your business is doing well, things are going well. The other thing we noticed, so this was the women. The men would often give very detailed descriptions of what to do, of how to run the business, and explanations. So they were walking them through things. They were giving them super detailed descriptions and explanation lists of who can help them. All of this stuff of, here's what you need to do, here's how you do it, let me walk you through the steps, right? This was men writing to their wives. Now, in later letters, you begin to see a transformation where it becomes our farm instead of your farm, right? Now it's our farm, or occasionally even my farm. And this is for the women. so that they began to take ownership, either jointly or individually, of it could be business too. I just wrote my farm, but this would, my farm, my business. The husband's letters began to stop telling the women what to do, telling the wives how and what to do, and also acknowledging and basically establishing and stating, we'll say, that they had this, that they were good, right? You know what to do. You're doing good. I don't need to explain to you. One woman wrote, when the war is over, right, I'm not going back to the way I want it, the way it was. I want a part in managing the farm. Right, and there was another woman that just basically, she wasn't that specific, but she basically said, yeah, things are changing when you come home. I like it this way, and I am not going back to the other. So the other was more politely said of, when the war is over, I want a part in managing our farm. And the other one was like, just, yeah, you're not sticking me back to the way it was. I'm good at this, and I want a part in it. Okay, and the last thing that we're going to look at is Republican motherhood. This was after the war was over, and you have this was very specifically and intentionally created after the war for women. And basically what it was connected to the ideology of founding a nation. So this idea of, okay, we're creating a new nation, and we're going to have these Republican ideals. And again, Republican does not mean like a political party at this point. So children need to be taught Republican ideals. So just remember that, right? Well, I'll put here, not the political party, because that's mostly what we think of now. They were calling it the Republic, right? Because we're a constitutional republic, not necessarily full democracy, which we'll talk about when we talk about the Constitution. And that this was the mother's role now, was to teach her children these Republican ideologies. Now, in the past role of women, of mothers, was to teach daughters skills in the domestic sphere. Okay, so how to be a good housewife, how to sew, how to weave, that type of stuff. They didn't teach sons, right? That was the husband's job. Now what they're saying is, no, the mother is to teach children, right? This is both boys and girls. And you're not just teaching household domestic sphere stuff. What is the things that they need to be teaching? Well, they need to be teaching history. They need to be teaching American values. So they need to know some government too. And if they're going to do that, they also need to know literature. And they need to know reading and writing. So these are things, at least at the bare minimum, that the women need to teach their kids. Okay, well, but then the question becomes with that, and up to a certain age, because eventually you're going to have a shift from this to public education, and that all kids should be going to school, like elementary school. It was, not like K through 12, but like through 10 to 12, from 6 or 7 to 12, all kids, boys and girls, should go to school. which was a new thing. The Puritans had done it for women, but the rest of the colonies had not. And now they're going to begin shifting to that. But in the meantime, women need to be teaching their children, raising them up, even at a younger age before, even once schools existed. The mother's responsibility is still to instill this stuff within her children at a young age so that they're good Republican citizens. But if women are going to be able to teach this to their children, women need to be educated. Which is then why it gets to the fact that girls can go to school. So that was a big step for women, that it became accepted to be educated. This is going to lead to women being able to be teachers, not just of children, of their kids, I mean, but to be teachers, to be able for lead to women to be teachers in public school. So that you have now an additional outside of the home job. But what's key with this is that it's still connected to the domestic sphere. Right? You have everything we see when we look at women's roles as they improve or add additional things that they can do are connected to that sphere. So you have midwife, that's acceptable, right, as a role, because that's helping give birth. Then you're going to have teachers, right? And within this domestic sphere is motherhood. But teachers, if you're raising your kids and you're educating their kids, but that was also the argument. Women should be able to teach their kids these things because they're already nurturing them and loving them and helping educate them in basic ways of life anyways. What's the difference to add history and literature? So we have to add, so this is also, right, you could put that the whole point of education, that women can be educated, comes from that. Later, nursing, right, this starts at the Civil War as official. But, I mean, midwife was kind of already doing that unofficially. But it's the same thing. Well, women nurture their children. They care for their children and family. That's part of motherhood, too. So everything had to be connected to that. But it's an important step. Because they wanted women to teach their children about Republican values, because they thought that this was an important component, and because that then led to education of women, it eventually led to more opportunities for women. This was central to further steps we see later on. So it is important. I don't want to undercut it, but it definitely was still connected to the domestic sphere. Okay, that is where we are ending with Revolutionary War in Society. We'll be looking in future lectures about the creating of a nation, the Articles of Confederation, and why those failed, to then creating the Constitutional Convention, what the Constitution was about, Bill of Rights, so on and so on.